Tax or debt? How do modern states govern their people? Of course, it is difficult to understand this system without accepting the realities. The money we earn is not neutral. We accept the money we earn as a medium of exchange, but money has never been merely a medium of exchange. How the state is constructed is exactly where money begins to turn into a primary instrument. And most importantly, this instrument is used to keep people under obedience. In the earlier stages, human societies functioned through a barter system. However, the difficulty, inefficiency, or so-called need for development of barter was not the main reason for the emergence of money. Historical sources show that the widespread use of money arose from states' need to collect taxes and maintain standing armies. For the state, the main question was not how will people trade, but how will I extract resources from people? Tax is not a system consisting of your budget or the money you collect. Tax is the act of recording your name within the country, meaning systematizing your identity and address. You think you are paying money, but in reality, you are only being registered in a systematized manner. In other words, everything here is in the hands of the state. The money goes, but all your data remains stored. Historically, states first created tax obligations and then made monetary circulation compulsory in order to fulfill these obligations. The moment the state says, you can only pay taxes with the money I accept, the market is no longer voluntary. People enter the market to earn that money, sell their labor, and divide their time. This compulsion operates under the appearance of economic freedom, but in essence it is structured obedience. The power and structure of taxation do not lie in its openness but in its concealment. People know that they pay, the money leaves their hands. It is deducted from wages every day, added to every purchase, and begins to be recorded in documents. All of this is visible because tax is legal under the state. In every country, actions that are under the law and systematized are not questioned. People may be dissatisfied with the amount they receive, but this is a systematized function. Tax is discussed, but it is never abolished. In ancient empires, taxation was direct in form. Grain tax, labor tax, military service. In the modern era, taxation has taken more complex and indirect forms. VAT, excise taxes, social insurance contributions, fees. Some of these payments are taken in ways that people do not directly feel. Thus, tax is visible, but its pain is reduced. When pain decreases, resistance also decreases. The tax system exists not only to collect money, but to demonstrate the state's priorities. Whichever tax the state needs more and whichever activity it wants to encourage, it keeps that tax under its control. Tax is not merely an economic instrument. It directs people's lifestyles. This raises the question of tax policy. Of course, it cannot be simplified only in this way. Tax is a political decision. However, taxation has a limit. Throughout history, states have tested this limit many times. When taxes increase too much, open discontent arises. Revolts, protests, and legitimacy crises emerge. When people perceive taxes as unjust, the authority of the state begins to weaken. At precisely this point, tax alone is no longer sufficient. Until the late Middle Ages, states were governed in this manner. Wars existed in every era and were considered the most important issue for states. Armies were assembled temporarily and expenses were limited. Taxes were not stable. They were increased or decreased depending on the state's decisions. But technological development disrupted this balance. States began to acquire gunpowder, and over time, this expanded. Wars were no longer short as before. Standing armies were created, weapons began to take form, and logistics changed. As a result, state expenditures increased sharply. Tax proved insufficient to cover these new expenses. Increasing taxes further created political risk. People had now become not only taxpayers, but also those who suffered losses. At this stage, states needed a new mechanism, one that was quieter, less visible, and provoked less resistance. The concept of debt gradually began to form at the center of the state, but debt was not only a financial instrument, it was a political strategy for people. The state borrowed, not merely to find money. This meant spending its future and its revenues today. It meant using labor not yet performed and plans not yet realized in advance. The main difference between tax and debt is visibility. Tax hurts today. Debt hurts the future. Because people do not feel the pain of borrowing today, they react less to it. For the state, this is an ideal situation because political responsibility decreases and financial maneuverability increases. Tax can be thought of as a relationship between humanity and society. Debt, on the other hand, is income that arrives through indirect paths. The state spends, but the bill is not presented immediately. It appears years later, reduced services, cuts, and so on. By then, the cause has already been forgotten. Thus, the modern state model rests on two main pillars: tax as an open instrument of governance and debt as a silent instrument of governance. Tax is the visible face of the state. Debt is its shadow. People usually react to what is visible and feel the shadow too late. To understand the modern state, its governance, and its core system, it is not enough to look only at tax rates. More questions arise. Why does the state borrow? How large is this debt? From whom is this debt taken? When these questions are answered, everything becomes clearer. Because tax shapes the present, while debt shapes the future. History shows that states rarely borrow with the consent of the people. Debt is presented through technical terms, financial documents, and under the name of budget deficits. Thus, debt is removed from political debate and presented as a technical problem. But the essence does not change. It is the control of power over time. Money is no longer neutral. It is not just a piece of paper. For the state, it was not merely a market instrument. It was a mechanism for managing time, the ability to pull future resources into today's expenditures. Any state can do this. Most importantly, when tax is insufficient, debt emerges. As a result, the modern individual pays twice at the same time, first through tax and second through the consequences of debt. However, the second payment is usually not noticed. Because it is not deducted from wages, it is not written on a label. It is felt as declining purchasing power, weakening social services, and narrowing opportunities. Many questions arise: is tax too high? In fact, this is not the main question. The most important ones are these. What does the state govern? How? Why? Where does tax end and debt begin? And the most critical question, in whose favor does this balanced system operate? As long as these questions remain unanswered, the mechanism of governance remains invisible, and an invisible mechanism is the strongest mechanism, because people cannot resist what they cannot name. In this picture, the question is no longer, is tax too high? The main question is this: which instrument does the state use, when, and for what purpose? Where does tax end, and where does debt begin? And most importantly, in whose favor does this balance work? Gunpowder warfare and debt policies began to be used as instruments. The shift of states toward debt and acting accordingly was not a coincidence. As technology developed, the era began to force this. It was an age of war. Armies were assembled from peasants and weapons were produced in simple forms. When the war ended, debt and expenditure also ended, and the state budget returned to normal. However, this balance was permanently disrupted with the spread of gunpowder. Gunpowder did not merely change weapon technology, it also changed the economic structure of the state. Cannons, muskets, and the redesign of fortresses turned war from an instant confrontation into a long-term industry. War was no longer fought only on the battlefield. It continued in factories, warehouses, ports, and treasuries. In the age of gunpowder, three things were required for war: a standing army, constant supply, and constant money. When this trio came together, tax alone began to prove insufficient. Tax collection took time, created political risk, and suffocated economic production. War, however, did not wait. States needed a faster, more flexible financial source. Debt was no longer merely a financial gap. It began to turn into a strategic tool. As people increasingly fell into debt, the state gained time. Debt converted future revenues into present expenditures. This made it possible to continue wars without the consent of the people. Tax requires consent. Debt requires only a technical decision. This difference explains why states turn to debt so rapidly. Taxes are debated in parliaments, protests occur in the streets, but debt agreements are often signed behind closed doors. By the time public opinion forms, the decision has already been implemented. At this stage, state debt began to function not merely as a financial burden, but as a mechanism for transferring political responsibility. The authority that makes decisions today leaves the consequences to tomorrow's authority. This creates conditions for riskier and more aggressive decisions within the state apparatus. War financing was now built on debt. When this happened, the relationship between the state and citizens changed. Previously, war was a direct demand. Taxes, food, and other resources were collected openly. People immediately felt the increased costs. The debt model forced this relationship to be established through indirect paths. This is the illusion that makes war appear cheap. In reality, war becomes more expensive. Only the time of payment is postponed. This postponement creates political comfort. For the sake of short-term popularity, the state creates a long-term financial burden. The first systematic state debts in history began to form precisely in this period. Italian city-states, especially Venice and Genoa, became pioneers of this model. They used debt not chaotically, but in a structured way. Debt instruments, interest, and repayment plans were formed. State debt turned into a market. The most critical feature of this market was that the debt was internal. The state borrowed from its own citizens. This was not merely collecting money, it was creating political attachment. When a citizen lent money, they developed a personal interest in the continuity of the state. The collapse of the state meant the loss of their investment. Debt began to turn into a mechanism of loyalty. As the public became indebted, it wanted the state to earn more revenue and increase its budget. Citizens were no longer only debt payers and taxpayers. They became partners of the state. Of course, they did not do this voluntarily. They were compelled. This system created double gains for the state. First, it obtained immediate financing. Second, it bound potential opponents to itself financially. An invisible but strong bond emerged between the borrowing state and the lending citizen. This model changed over time, but its logic did not. In the modern era, most debt is now taken through institutional investors, banks, and funds. But the result is the same. The borrowing state is forced to consider the interests of the lending structures. The sovereignty of the state over its citizens changed, but in form it appeared the same and independent. Budget decisions were no longer made only for domestic politics, but were shaped according to the expectations of lenders. Here, the relationship between war and debt deepens further. Wars financed by debt last longer, because financial constraints are not felt immediately. This distances states from diplomatic solutions. War becomes a sustainable activity. This illusion of sustainability reduces the sense of responsibility within the state apparatus. Short-term political gain is placed above long-term financial risk. This leads to the internal weakening of the state. Many empires in history began to collapse precisely at this stage. The debt burden continued to grow. The main functions of the state began to change. Social services were reduced. Taxes were increased indirectly. But society became blind and saw nothing, because the changes occurred gradually. For this reason, it is wrong to read the birth of debt merely as an economic innovation. Debt is part of war technology. Weapons destroy on the battlefield. Debt destroys within time. The first destroys buildings. The second destroys the financial backbone of the state. As a result, the modern state does not wage war only with armies. It wages war with budgets, with debt, and with time. In this war, the losing side often realizes who it is too late, because the blow comes silently, not loudly. Inflation, debt, and the silent end of great empires. Every state throughout history has faced the same problems. Expenditures increased, but the tolerance of the people was limited. Tax increases were limited and created discontent. Each of these carried political risk. The most effective tool for the modern era, not open taxation, Hidden loss of value. Inflation is not merely an economic term. It is the result of a political decision. The value of money does not disappear naturally. States reduce it. Throughout history, inflation has often been used for extraordinary situations: wars, debt crises, uncontrolled state spending. But in the modern era, inflation has become not an emergency, but a permanent mechanism. Tax was direct, inflation is silent. It is felt immediately in daily life. The same products, the same services, but less remains in your hand. The state, of course, does not ask for consent, it simply takes. This mechanism was known 1,000 years ago. Al-Ghazali explained the moral consequences of manipulating the value of money. In his view, money is not merely a medium of exchange. It is the trust structure of society. When the value of money is corrupted, people lose trust not only in the market, but also in each other. This means the internal decay of society. Modern inflation accelerates exactly this decay. People work, but the value they earn is not preserved. Saving becomes meaningless. Long-term planning becomes difficult. In this situation, debt appears even more attractive, because debt saves today, but by weakening the future. Thus, debt and inflation turn into a cycle that feeds each other. The state borrows and resorts to inflation to reduce the debt. Inflation forces the public to borrow more. This creates an economic spiral, at the center of which stands a weakening middle class. History has repeatedly observed the results of this model. As the Ottoman Empire became increasingly dependent on foreign debts, it lost financial independence. Revenues were directed first not to domestic needs, but to debt obligations. The state formally existed, but its economic decisions were shaped by others' interests. This situation was not unique to the Ottomans. Spain, France, and Chinese empires also fell into similar financial traps. The common point was the same: long-term expenditures, continuous wars, debt-financed spending, and ultimately devalued money. The dangerous aspect of this process is its slow operation. A state does not collapse overnight. Empires do not suddenly fall apart. First, they lose financial elasticity. Then social bonds weaken. Next, institutional trust collapses. Finally, the political structure can no longer endure. At this point, history does not only explain the past, it also warns the future. When Sun Tzu said that prolonged wars destroy the state from within, he did not mean only military resources. He considered human power, finance, and moral resilience together. Modern wars, however, are often fought not in trenches, but in budget tables. The most dangerous aspect of any process is its slowness. History shows that a state does not collapse overnight. Great empires do not suddenly disintegrate or vanish. First they lose financial elasticity, then social bonds weaken. Finally, the political structure can no longer stand. This delay creates comfort for political systems. A short-term image of stability is maintained. But in the long term, the structure weakens, the middle class shrinks, social mobility declines, and economic inequality deepens. At this point, the problem turns from an economic one into a social crisis. The collapse of empires is often explained by external attacks, but history shows that in most cases, the final blow is only the last stage. The real collapse occurs before that, in balance sheets, budget deficits, and debt charts. For this reason, the idea that empires die on the battlefield is incomplete. Empires first die financially. The battlefield is merely the official announcement of that death. When the state no longer has the power to respond, military defeat becomes inevitable. When we look at the modern era, we see that falling into tax and debt traps has become difficult to avoid. People lose. The state system becomes more complex over time, and this creates major problems for humanity. This complexity hides the problem but does not eliminate it. Economic reality eventually turns into social reality. People begin to feel not what the system gives them, but what it takes from them. As this feeling strengthens, political consequences become inevitable. The main message of history is simple but harsh. A state without financial discipline cannot be long-lived. Debt is a temporary solution, inflation is a hidden tax, and tax is political responsibility. Which one is chosen reveals the character of the state. The result? Modern states govern not through violence but through finance. People are governed not by weapons but by payment plans. If the plan breaks down, the system is questioned. History has not ended. It quietly asks the same question: how long can a state sustain today by mortgaging the future? The answer comes late, but when it comes, turning back is difficult.